storms pound the channel through the night, shaking the landing craft where thousands of men wait shoulder to shoulder. No movement. No talking. Just the thud of waves and the knowledge of what waits across the water. German guns already trained on the beaches. A few miles inland, in a dim canvas tent, Eisenhower leans over a map glowing under a lantern. Every choice bleeds. Every delay makes the odds worse. And here's the weight you can't escape. If this were your call, would you send them into the storm, or hold back and risk losing Europe? By the first week of June 1944, the Allied command faced a paradox no textbook had prepared them for. The most powerful invasion force in history was ready to move, yet completely powerless against the weather. Across southern England, more than 5,000 ships and landing craft stretched from horizon to horizon. Columns of trucks clogged narrow country roads. Paratroopers rehearsed their jumps in fields now stripped bare by constant training. Fuel depots were stacked high enough to level entire villages if a single spark hit the wrong place. Everything was finally assembled for Operation Overlord, the plan meant to break Hitler's grip on Europe. But none of it mattered if the Channel refused to cooperate. For days, the weather had worsened. Winds whipped the water into a brutal churn, strong enough to flip small craft and scatter formations. Low clouds strangled visibility. The forecast maps looked less like meteorology and more like a warning. The fleet needed a narrow window of calm seas, clear sky, low tide at dawn, and a half moon for the airborne landings. Miss even one of those elements and the invasion wouldn't just falter, it would collapse. Inside Southwick House, the nerve center of the Allied command, Eisenhower's War Council wrestled with that reality. Meteorologists argued, admirals paced, commanders studied maps already worn thin by weeks of planning. Everyone understood the same brutal math. A delay of 24 to 48 hours might improve conditions, or break the entire operation beyond repair. The Germans expected an Allied invasion, but they believed it would come at Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point, heavily fortified and closer to German airfields. Their deception plan, Operation Fortitude, had fed that belief beautifully. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, false radio chatter. The Allies built a shadow force so convincing that Hitler kept divisions pinned in Calais long after D-Day began. But that illusion had an expiration date. If the Allies stalled too long, the Germans would notice the cracks. And there was another, quieter pressure: the men. Nearly 3 million Allied troops were now in Britain. They had trained for months. They had written their last letters home. They had climbed into landing craft expecting to cross the Channel, not to wait days in a suspended state between dread and destiny. Every delay tightened the knot of fear, sharpened the sense of finality, and increased the risk of leaks, accidents, or a Luftwaffe lucky strike on the overcrowded ports. Eisenhower understood all of this more clearly than anyone. His job wasn't simply to command the invasion, it was to judge the moment. Commit too early and he'd send men into chaos. Commit too late and the entire plan might unravel. The clock wasn't his enemy. The weather wasn't his enemy. Uncertainty was. As the storm hammered on, the pressure inside the command room deepened. General Montgomery pushed for patience. Admiral Ramsey warned that high seas would turn the landings into a disaster before the first shot was fired. Air Marshal Lee Mallory feared heavy losses for the airborne troops, predicting up to 70% casualties if they jumped in poor visibility. Each voice carried weight, and Eisenhower listened to all of them, not as a committee of equals, but as fragments of a picture only he could put together. By the night of June 4th, morale in the command room cracked. The forecast was bleak. The consensus leaned toward postponement. Eisenhower made the call to delay the invasion by 24 hours, a decision that rippled instantly across southern England. Troops who had already boarded were told to remain in place. Some units had to turn back to land. Others stayed stuck at sea in miserable conditions, seasick in cramped holds, waiting for an order that never came. And here's the twist that sits quietly in the background of every D-Day story. The Allies didn't have many alternative dates left. Tides and moonlight wouldn't align again for weeks. A prolonged delay could expose their entire deception plan. This is the moment where strategy bled into vulnerability. a moment whose echoes would surface again in places far from Normandy, including a forest Belgium thought would never become a battlefield again. All eyes turned to June 5th. The storm still raged. The forecasts still conflicted, and Eisenhower had reached the point where waiting any longer might do more damage than moving forward. By dawn, everyone in the command room understood one thing. The decision was approaching its final, irreversible moment. Eisenhower's decision didn't exist in a vacuum. It sat at the intersection of human fear, tactical necessity, political pressure, and the enemy's own miscalculations. To understand the gamble, you have to see the moment from every side. Across southern England, tens of thousands of soldiers lay awake in barracks, tents, and steel compartments barely big enough for a man to stretch his legs. They had rehearsed every movement, how to disembark, how to crawl under fire, how to survive the chaos of a beach landing. But training couldn't quiet the mind when the invasion was postponed. Some men tried to sleep on wooden benches, helmets balanced on their chests. Others paced. A few prayed silently. Most simply stared at the floor, replaying what little they knew. Rumors traveled faster than official announcements. One minute they were sailing. The next they were not. The uncertainty pulled at them like a tide. For many, the hardest part wasn't fighting. It was waiting. What Eisenhower couldn't speak aloud was something they all sensed. Any delay meant their chances didn't necessarily get better. Storms could trap them on the water. Morale could crack. The Germans could realize the truth. And if the invasion shifted by weeks, the surprise could evaporate entirely. From a purely military perspective, Overlord was a masterpiece stitched together with fragile thread. The tides needed to be low at dawn so engineers could clear beach obstacles before they vanished under the waves. The moon needed to be bright enough for paratroopers to find their drop zones. Air support required clear skies. Naval bombardment demanded predictable seas. Every part of the invasion relied on the others. And here's the thing. The storm didn't just threaten to disrupt one element. It threatened to collapse the entire chain. Admiral Ramsey knew better than anyone that rough seas could scatter landing craft across miles of coastline. Even a small deviation could strand infantry in deep water, weighed down by gear and swallowed before reaching the sand. If that happened at scale, the Germans wouldn't need to kill the invaders, the ocean would. Lee Mallory had his own nightmare scenario. If cloud cover held, paratroopers would drift miles off course, landing in fields they had never studied, into towns crawling with German patrols. He'd already warned Eisenhower that the airborne component was too risky. The storm only amplified his fear. Every warning carried the same truth. Weather wasn't a variable. It was the deciding factor. Eisenhower had spent years refining the balance between caution and resolve. He wasn't a battlefield general in the traditional sense. He commanded people, nations, egos, and expectations. He was the man trusted to coordinate the British, Americans, Canadians, Free French, Poles, Australians, and others into a single coherent force. But his real burden was solitude. In moments like this, no committee could save him. Advisors argued from their corners: naval, air, ground, intelligence, meteorology. Everyone saw their slice. Only Eisenhower had to see the whole picture. And he knew something the others didn't fully grasp. Delay was risk, but so was momentum. The longer the invasion waited, the greater the chance that something, somewhere, would break the illusion. He was also aware of an uncomfortable truth. If D-Day failed, it wouldn't be their failure. It would be his, etched into history forever. Operation Overlord leaned heavily on technology: landing craft, Higgins boats, amphibious tanks, radar, weather models, bombers, gliders, and thousands of logistical systems. But none of it was invincible. Weather radars were primitive. Forecasting models were closer to educated guesses than scientific certainty. Even the most advanced Allied radios struggled with range and clarity during storms. The vast invasion fleet itself was vulnerable. Fuel leaks, overloaded transports, gliders at the mercy of wind. The Allies held the technological advantage, but the storm didn't care. The tools that made the invasion possible could just as easily turn into liabilities. Across the Channel, the Germans believed they had time. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with defending the Atlantic Wall, had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. The weather convinced him nothing significant could happen. Other commanders relaxed their alert levels. Patrols continued, but the urgency had faded. Ultra intercepts had already shown the Allies that German intelligence was blind, clinging to the belief that the invasion would strike at Calais. Even Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was a diversion. The irony was brutal. The same storm tormenting the Allies lulled the Germans into a false sense of calm. This wasn't just a military judgment. It was moral, philosophical, almost existential. D-Day wasn't guaranteed to succeed. Even under perfect conditions, it was a gamble with staggering human cost. Commanders estimated losses in the tens of thousands on the first day alone. Eisenhower, who had visited the troops, looked into the eyes of the men who would lead the first wave. Some were barely old enough to shave. Some were fathers. Some were already quietly accepting they might never return. He carried their faces with him. And yet, he also carried the weight of Europe, the occupied cities, the broken families, the tens of millions trapped under Nazi rule. Doing nothing was its own kind of violence. That's the hidden truth behind the decision. It wasn't a choice between life and death. It was a choice between different forms of loss. Behind every military calculation sat a political one. Roosevelt needed progress in Europe to justify America's massive wartime spending. Churchill needed a victory to reassure a weary British public that years of bombing, rationing, and sacrifice were not in vain. Stalin demanded a second front to relieve the crushing weight his armies were facing in the East, and he demanded it loudly. Eisenhower felt all of it. The Allies had promised an invasion. The world was waiting for it. Any significant delay risked political fractures, public doubt, or worse, a shift in Soviet trust. A stalled invasion wasn't just a tactical problem. It had the power to reshape alliances. The storm over the Channel wasn't merely a weather event. It was a diplomatic choke point. Allied intelligence had spent months building the deception plan, feeding German scouts, spies, and analysts a steady diet of fabrications. But deception is most fragile right before the truth hits. MI5 worried that a prolonged delay might force them to recycle tactics that were never meant to be used twice. Chief officers warned that radio patterns would change if troops stayed in holding longer than planned. Even civilian movements, buses, ferries, local activity, risked creating patterns the Germans might spot. The truth was unsettling. Even the most successful deception plan could be unraveled by time. Delay became the enemy of secrecy. The invasion force was so large it had gravitational pull. Supply lines feeding it were already stretched to their limits. Food, ammunition, medical equipment, fuel. Everything flowed toward the coast in a constant stream. Stopping the invasion wasn't as simple as saying, wait. Every delay meant more resources piling up in staging areas that were already overflowing. Refrigeration units struggled to keep rations cold. Fuel drums were stacked dangerously high. Trains and convoys fell behind schedule because there was nowhere left to unload. The machinery of war had momentum, and halting it carried its own risk of collapse. Eisenhower was not a man easily shaken, but this decision forced him into territory no training manual covered. Advisors contradicted each other. Forecasts shifted by the hour. Lives depended on a guess, and so, in the quiet moments, doubt crept in. What if Ramsey was right? What if Lee Mallory's projections held true? What if the airborne landings shattered before they hit the ground? What if the Germans guessed correctly on June 7th instead of June 6th? Yet here's what set Eisenhower apart. He didn't hide those doubts. He acknowledged them, weighed them, and kept going. Leadership in that moment wasn't about confidence. It was about clarity, seeing fear, and still choosing a path through it. Across England, towns and villages felt the tension in the air. Roads that had been quiet for years now trembled with the rumble of tanks and half-tracks. Windows glowed through blackout curtains as families stayed awake, listening to the distant throb of engines moving toward the coast. Some civilians prayed for the boys they'd housed. Others feared retaliation if the invasion failed and Germany tightened its grip on the continent. And many felt a strange, heavy silence, a before that everyone knew would soon become an after. This wasn't just a military decision. It was a moment that reshaped ordinary lives across a country already scarred by war. Inside the German command structure, contradictions paralyzed any real response. Rommel believed the invasion had to be stopped at the beaches. Rundstedt insisted on holding armored divisions inland. Hitler refused to release reserve panzer units without his personal approval, even if the invasion happened at night while he slept. The Atlantic Wall, for all its scale, was not a unified defense. It was a patchwork of beliefs, egos, and assumptions, and the storm convinced many German officers they had time. Patrols eased. Commanders relaxed. Sentries huddled under cover instead of pacing the shoreline. A few days of bad weather did what Allied bombs could not. It softened the enemy's vigilance. This miscalculation formed the quiet space in which Eisenhower's gamble would either succeed or shatter. By the early hours of June 5th, the atmosphere inside Southwick House had shifted from debate to something sharper: inevitability. The storm still pounded the channel, but the forecast carried a flicker of possibility. A brief break. A narrow gap. Not calm seas, just survivable ones. At 03:30, the key meteorologist stepped into the command room, soaked from the rain outside, charts clutched tight. They spoke quickly, almost cautiously. The storm might ease by the next night. Winds would still be rough, clouds still heavy, but the worst might pass. That might hung in the air like a blade. Eisenhower gathered his commanders. No speeches. No ceremony. Just the question that would decide the largest amphibious assault in history. The discussion turned fast. Ramsey warned conditions would still be far from ideal. Montgomery pushed for action. The men were ready. The plan was ready. The window might not come again. Lee Mallory repeated his fear that the airborne operation would be a slaughter. Eisenhower listened. And then the room went quiet. You could hear chairs shift. You could hear the storm against the windows. You could hear the weight of the moment landing on every man present. This wasn't strategy anymore. This was commitment. Eisenhower asked one final time if anyone believed success was impossible. No one spoke. And so, with a voice steady enough to mask the gravity behind it, he made the decision that changed the century. Okay, let's go. Those 3 words rippled outward faster than any broadcast. Officers sprinted down hallways. Radios crackled to life. Couriers jumped into jeeps and roared into the darkness. The invasion, delayed for a day, was now underway. There would be no turning back. Across England, engines that had been silent now thundered awake. Landing craft crews hauled mooring lines. Transport pilots ran last checks on their aircraft. Paratroopers tightened straps and loaded gear, some of them whispering the same question they'd whispered the night before. Will we make it to the ground alive? The storm hadn't vanished. It had only loosened its grip. Rain still fell in sheets. The channel still rolled hard, slamming waves into steel hulls. Men vomited over the sides of transport ships as seasickness spread through the decks. Officers tried to hide their worry. Even seasoned sailors felt the unease. The operation was moving into danger, not away from it. At airfields across southern England, the airborne troops assembled in long, silent lines. The wind clawed at their parachutes. Ground crews struggled to keep aircraft stable on the tarmac. Officers shouted final instructions over the roar of engines. Many paratroopers carried notes in their pockets. Names, addresses, messages that might be the last they ever wrote. At 22 Sundax on June 5th, the first C-47s lifted into the dark. Formation after formation rose behind them, engines vibrating the ground as hundreds of planes climbed into the night. The sky over England filled with running lights, streaks of white, red, and green pushing toward the unknown. This was the moment every commander feared. If the winds shifted even slightly, the drops would scatter. If the clouds thickened, navigation would break down. If German spotters caught the formations too early, anti-aircraft guns would turn the sky into a killing field. But the Armada kept going. Across the channel, German radar stations caught faint glimpses of movement, so faint they dismissed it as patrol activity. Storms had trained them to lower their guard. Their belief in Calais held firm, and so the first wave of Allied aircraft crossed the coast with far less resistance than expected. When the jump lights switched from red to green, paratroopers stepped into the void. Wind ripped at their gear. Darkness swallowed them. Many drifted far from target zones, landing in hedgerows, flooded fields, orchards, even behind German outposts. A few drowned in marshes. Others dropped silently into backyards where startled civilians watched shadows fall from the sky. The landings were messy, scattered, chaotic, but they achieved the one thing the plan depended on: confusion. German commanders couldn't tell if dozens had landed, or thousands. They sent reports that contradicted each other. Units moved at random. No one understood the scale of what was happening. All the while, the invasion fleet, thousands of ships strong, crept across the channel behind them. The storm hadn't vanished, but it had eased enough to make the crossing brutal instead of impossible. Men huddled under decks, seasick and silent. Officers checked watches in the dim red light. Engines echoed across the waves. Destroyers cut through the dark like shadows. There was no more hesitation, no more delay. The gamble was in motion, and as dawn approached, the first shapes of the Normandy coastline began to rise out of the mist. Beaches that had been scouted from the air, charted on maps, studied by planners, yet never seen by the men who were about to step onto them. By 0330 on June 6, 1944, the Armada had fully revealed itself. Thousands of ships stretched so far across the channel that veterans later said the sea looked paved with steel. Destroyers carved paths ahead. Battleships followed with their guns angled toward the French coast. Landing craft swayed violently in the dark, each one packed with men who could feel the sandbars of Normandy pulling them closer. The Germans still didn't believe it. Reports trickled into their command posts, scattered paratroopers, unexplained explosions, aircraft moving inland. But the storm and the deception plan had done their work. Senior officers hesitated, waiting for confirmation. Rundstedt wanted to move the Panzer reserves. Rommel was still in Germany. Hitler slept. And so, at the moment when reaction mattered most, no one in the German command structure took responsibility for acting. The Allies were about to hit the one place the Germans thought least likely, at the one time they believed least possible. At 0530, the bombardment began. Battleships opened fire with the kind of force you feel more than hear. A deep, rolling shockwave that rippled through the air and water. Shells screamed overhead and slammed into the coastline, throwing pillars of sand and concrete skyward. Shore defenses shook. Bunkers rattled. German sentries dove for cover, stunned awake by a thunder they hadn't expected. For 5 long minutes, the horizon burned. Then came the moment every man aboard the landing craft had rehearsed 100 times but never truly felt. The command to load and advance. Engines revved. Ramps shook. Metal groaned under the weight of movement. Officers shouted over the roar of surf and machine parts. Higgins boats lined up in rough waves, water splashing over their bows as they pushed toward the beaches. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, soared, each one different in terrain, defenses, and the brutal odds waiting on shore. At Omaha, the situation deteriorated almost immediately. Stronger currents forced landing craft off course. Some units landed hundreds of yards from their planned zones. Engineers carrying explosives were dropped into deep water with full packs. Many sank before surfacing. German machine guns, untouched by the bombardment, snapped to life and raked the waterline with lethal precision. Men who had trained for months suddenly found themselves pinned behind sandbars, unable to advance, unable to retreat. The sea behind them churned with wreckage. The beach ahead erupted in bursts of smoke and sand, but on Utah Beach a small mistake created a strange twist of fate. Strong currents pushed the first wave nearly 2,000 yards south of the intended landing point, right into an area lightly defended. Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt, Jr., arriving in the very first craft, surveyed the situation and famously chose not to correct it. "We'll start the war from right here," he said. not as fiction or bravado, but as a calm recognition that the mistake had actually spared his men. Gold and Juno saw fierce resistance, but steady progress. Sword became a frantic race to secure bridges before German reinforcements arrived. Everywhere the storm still mattered. Waves slammed into craft. Equipment jammed with sand. Smoke clung to the air, mixing with fog and the last shreds of night. But despite the chaos, despite the scattered drops, despite the brutal odds, the beachheads began to form. One trench, one crater, one foothold at a time. What most documentaries skip is what happened offshore. The naval crews, sailors who rarely appear in the spotlight, fought a battle of their own. Minesweepers cleared lanes under threat of underwater explosions. Destroyers crept dangerously close to the shore to fire point-blank at bunkers hammering Omaha. One British destroyer, HMS Hermione, maneuvered so close to the beach that its guns fired almost horizontally into German positions, shielding American troops pinned down. These weren't improvisations. They were acts of necessity. The real turning point came when communications, scattered, unreliable, chaotic, began trickling back a single, indispensable message. The landings were holding. Not cleanly. Not uniformly. But holding by mid-morning, German commanders finally grasped the truth. Normandy wasn't a diversion. This was the invasion. But by then the damage was done. Their armored divisions weren't in position. Their reserves were locked behind orders requiring Hitler's approval. And Hitler famously had not awakened. The irony is harsh. A dictator asleep in a bunker allowed the Allies to establish the foothold they needed to break Europe open. On the beaches, progress came in grim inches. Soldiers crawled over shattered obstacles. Medics dragged wounded men behind tanks. Engineers blew gaps through barbed wire and mines. And slowly, agonizingly, the tide of bodies and steel pushed inland. The gamble Eisenhower made at Southwick House had become reality. Not clean, not predictable, but real, and then moving forward. By afternoon, beachheads linked. Supplies flowed. New waves of troops arrived. The greatest risk in modern military history had passed its breaking point and survived. The invasion was no longer a gamble. It was an irreversible fact. By nightfall on June 6th, the shoreline of Normandy no longer looked like a place that existed on any map. Smoke drifted across shattered dunes. Ruined bunkers slumped into craters carved by naval guns. Equipment, rifles, helmets, torn packs, lay scattered across sand stained by the cost of the day. But the beachheads were secure, not elegant, not according to plan, not even close, but secure enough that the Germans could no longer throw the Allies back into the sea. And that single fact reshaped the direction of the war more than any speech, treaty, or strategy ever could. For the soldiers who survived the first wave, the shock hadn't worn off. Many walked inland in silence, too exhausted to understand the scale of what they'd endured. Others sat where they were, trembling from adrenaline and cold, waiting for medics who were already overwhelmed. In the makeshift aid stations, doctors worked until their hands stopped responding. Stretchers lined the grass. Radios buzzed with partial reports. Some units still couldn't find their missing men. The cost of the landings, especially at Omaha, would take days to count. For Eisenhower, the news came in fragments. Small victories. Unexpected losses, units off course but rallying. Engineers securing causeways. British armored columns pushing deeper than anticipated. And at Omaha, the message he had feared most, delivered quietly by an exhausted staff officer. The situation is stabilizing. No triumph, no relief. Just a steadying truth. The line had held. He spent the evening walking among the airborne and infantry units preparing for the next day's operations. No cameras followed him. No speeches marked the moment. What mattered wasn't what he said, but how he carried himself, calm, steady, fully present. Even the men who didn't recognize him felt something shift when he passed. The sense that the worst had been survived, and that the next step, however dangerous, was now possible. For the Germans, the aftermath was a shockwave of confusion, Intelligence officers scrambled to understand the scale of what had happened. Commanders demanded reinforcements that didn't exist. Officers argued over maps. Some swore the invasion was still a feint. Others pushed for immediate counterattacks. The arguments were pointless. The moment for decisive reaction had passed while Hitler slept and the Panzer Reserve sat immobilized by bureaucracy. By the next morning, the Germans were no longer choosing strategy. They were reacting to it. Across Europe, occupied towns and villages heard the news in whispers. Resistance networks crackled with new energy. Families who had lived under terror for years looked toward the West with a cautious hope. No one celebrated yet. The war was far from over. But the invasion had broken something fundamental in the German war machine: the illusion of inevitability. In London, crowds gathered despite the blackout rules. People stared at the headlines with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They'd endured years of bombing, rationing, and grief. Now, finally, the long-promised turning point had arrived. And here's the quiet truth buried inside every account of D-Day. It could have failed, easily. A few more hours of storm. A few more miscalculations. A faster German response. The difference between disaster and victory rested on a decision made in a dim room, under a single lamp, while rain hammered the windows. Eisenhower would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. Before he slept that night, if he slept at all, he wrote a note accepting full responsibility if the invasion failed. He carried it in his pocket, ready to release it to the world. The note would never be needed, but he never threw it away. He kept it as a reminder of how close the gamble had come to breaking. And if you are watching this because you love the parts of World War II that seem unbelievable, but actually happened, subscribe for more. Because the story doesn't end on the beaches. The success at Normandy set off a chain reaction that would pull both sides into new battles. Some fought in hedgerows, others in frozen forests, and one of those forests would become the stage for a clash no one saw coming. Tomorrow we follow the men who carried this momentum into the Ardennes, unaware of the brutal storm waiting for them under the trees. As the sun rose on June 7th, the scale of what had happened finally took shape. The beaches were no longer battlefields, they were gateways. Supply ships unloaded non-stop. Engineers carved roads out of rubble. Bulldozers dragged aside wreckage to make way for fuel trucks and ambulances. What had begun as a fragile foothold hardened hour by hour into a bridgehead too large to erase. Behind the lines, officers pieced together scattered reports. Units that had landed miles off target were now linking up. Paratroopers who spent the ETI night fighting in orchards or hedgerows were regrouping for coordinated pushes inland. The front wasn't clean, but it was coherent. And in invasion warfare, coherence is life. For many soldiers, the emotional weight of the previous day hit harder now than during the chaos itself. Some wrote quick letters home, hands shaking. Others searched for friends they hadn't seen since landing. Chaplains prayed over rows of bodies. The invasion had succeeded, but it had left scars that no victory could soften. Eisenhower visited the wounded quietly, without ceremony. He spoke, in a low voice, offering a hand, a nod. A moment of attention that felt heavier than any headline. He knew better than anyone that the battle ahead, the breakout, the hedgerow fighting, the push toward Paris, would demand more sacrifice than the landings themselves. Yet he also knew that the hardest decision had already been made. The gamble he took in that storm had opened the door to the liberation of Europe, but it had also opened something else. A new phase of the war where the German army, though wounded, would fight with a desperation that made the months to come some of the bloodiest of the entire conflict. The irony is harsh. Victory on the beaches did not mean an easy road ahead. It meant the opposite. The Germans understood that too. Their commanders scrambled to contain the breach, funneling reserves toward Normandy as fast as the fractured command structure allowed. Hitler demanded counterattacks that were impossible. Rommel returned to a front already slipping from his control. Rundstedt warned the high command that the situation was collapsing, and was ignored. Normandy was no longer a question of if. It was now a question of how far the Allies could push before the Germans reorganized. And somewhere inside that uncertainty lay the seeds of another battle, one colder, darker, and far more unpredictable. Because as the Allies pushed inland, German planners were already thinking months ahead, sketching out a counterstrike that would test every assumption the West held about the war's trajectory. But no one on the beaches knew that. Not yet. They only knew what was in front of them. Wounded men, wreckage, smoke rising from the horizon, and a sense that something irreversible had begun. Eisenhower's gamble had reshaped the war, and the echo of that decision would soon reach a quiet forest in Belgium, where winter would trap tens of thousands between survival and annihilation. In the quiet hours after the landings, when the noise faded and the chaos settled into memory, one truth lingered above all others. History doesn't turn on certainties. It turns on people willing to choose in the dark. Eisenhower's decision wasn't heroic. It wasn't bold in the way legends like to paint it. It was something far harder. A measured acceptance of risk, responsibility, and the possibility of failure on a scale few human beings will ever face. He didn't know the storm would break. He didn't know the beaches would hold. He didn't know if thousands of letters home would become final goodbyes, but he chose, and that choice fractured the course of the war wide open. The men who landed on those beaches didn't see strategy or geopolitics. They saw each other, the ones who stumbled, the ones who stood, the ones who didn't rise again. Their courage carried the decision forward in ways no planner could calculate. What remains, looking back, is a sense of how thin the line was between disaster and deliverance, and how a single moment of resolve can redirect the path of millions. It is wars and myths, and these are the war stories they never told in school.